parts of her body were eaten.
Parts of her fucking
This
body
case
were
takes
fucking
place
what?
in the United States of America
Jesus.
on the 11th of September 2014. Tammy Jo Blanton was a 46-year-old woman who lived in Jeffersonville, Indiana. In 2014, Tammy began a relationship with a man named Joseph Oberhansley. She would later say that at first the relationship was going well, but after just a few weeks, Joseph began to change. Joseph had a rather dark past. Tammy was aware that he had been incarcerated for a crime that he committed, but she did not know the full ins and outs of exactly what happened. Most of the time, he would brush off the reason for his prison time, but the reason was incredibly sinister. In 1998, when Joseph was 18, he was dating a 17-year-old named Sabrina. The two had a child together, although Joseph was under the impression that she had cheated and the child wasn't his. On the 9th of December 1998, only days after the birth of their child, Sabrina went over to Joseph's mother's house to visit without him. On this day, Joseph had taken a large amount of illegal substances and made his way over to his mother's house. Upon entering, he was enraged to see Sabrina standing there. In response, Joseph pulled out a gun and fired. He shot Sabrina as she held their child. Joseph's mother then jumped in front of Sabrina and the child, but Joseph opened fire on her too and shot a bullet in her back. Joseph then turned and fired a shot at his sister, who was also present, but thankfully the bullet
was killing everyone.
After shooting his girlfriend and his own mother, Joseph turned the weapon on himself. He placed it under his chin and fired. Sabrina tragically died from her injury. The baby, however, did manage to survive, along with Joseph's mother. She was treated for her injuries and was able to make a recovery. The bullet that Joseph had fired into his own head became lodged in his brain, and he too was able to make a recovery. Once he recovered, he was charged with murder and attempted murder. At the trial, Joseph's defense team argued that he wasn't guilty of murder. His father and brother had recently passed away, and he had turned to alcohol and other substances to cope. They argued that these circumstances had caused a great deal of stress in his life, and that because of this, the crime should be seen as manslaughter instead. The defense team was successful, and Joseph was found guilty of manslaughter in the year 2000. In July of 2012, after serving 12 years, Joseph was released from prison on parole. Joseph headed for Indiana to join his mother, who forgave him shortly after he had shot her. During his time in prison, she even advocated for his release. However, it wouldn't take too long for Joseph to commit another crime. Whilst on parole in 2013, Joseph went to a bar. Whilst drinking, he got into a fight with a fellow patron and ended up choking this man out. Multiple sources have claimed that he resisted arrest and was even naked during this attack. Despite his previous conviction, Joseph was allowed to be released on bail, and because he was released on bail, he met Tammy. So now, we arrive back to 2014. As I said earlier, Joseph and Tammy were in a relationship, but shortly into this relationship, Joseph began to change. He became controlling and aggressive. But then, Tammy confided with a friend and told this friend that Joseph had done something truly horrific. On the 5th of September, Joseph held her captive in her home and repeatedly forced himself upon her for 2 days. Because she was so scared of Joseph, she did what he wanted, as to not anger him further. This occurred around 4 months into their relationship. Once she was away from Joseph after being held captive, she ended the relationship. But Joseph wouldn't take no for an answer. Following the breakup, he continued to harass Tammy and would often show up at her home and her work, which of course greatly intimidated her. Some text messages would later be found on Tammy's phone, which were sent to Joseph. The messages go as follows. You can choose to be in denial about what happened on Saturday into Sunday. I won't be in denial. No one, and I mean no one, gets to terrify me like you did on Sunday. I will never forget it as long as I live. She went on to say, I do not want to involve the police, but if you leave me no choice, that is what I will have to do.
Where's that eye?
Tammy called her father and asked him to change the
Pictures are a
locks
bit
on
dodgy.
her
Where's that
home.
eye?
Meanwhile, not feeling safe, Tammy stayed at one of her friends' houses for a couple of days. Once the locks were changed, she returned home and told her friends that she had the police on speed dial and kept chairs under the door handles of her house. At 3 a.m. on September the 11th, 2014, Tammy awoke and heard the sounds of someone trying to break into her home.
Oh, God.
Of course, she knew exactly who this would be. She called 911 to say that her ex-boyfriend was trying to break in. The police soon arrived on the scene and told Joseph that he needed to move along. Joseph did as he was told,
I would have shot him.
and the police watched him walk
Come to
away.
my door. What?
The
What's good?
police were-
Fuck that. Come to my door. What's good? What's good? Yeah, I'm in your face, bitch. What's good? No, you're shot around here. What? You try to run? Light work. You think a guy like that's scaring me? You think a guy like that's scaring me? I'm gonna what? Guy's dead. Light work.
Content that no arrest had to be made, and the issue,
that's what I do
as
if I was
far as
her.
they were
Light work.
concerned, was settled. The following morning rolled around. Colleagues of Tammy clocked that she was late for work, but as more time passed, they became deeply concerned. Tammy was nowhere to be seen, and from what I can tell, she wasn't known to skip work and not call in as to why. The colleagues that worked with
Yeah, she
Tammy
did.
were very well aware of the troubles
She did.
Joseph had been causing her. They began to assume that something was horribly wrong.
Yeah, she
so
did.
they contacted the police
Nigga came to her house.
and asked them to go
She
over
gone
to
missing.
Tammy's
Yeah, she's
house
dead.
and check on her to see if everything was okay. Officers were dispatched to the location and arrived on the scene. They approached the house believing that what they would be dealing with was a simple welfare check. However, when officers arrived at Tammy's house, they found Joseph outside, and they noted that he seemed to be nervous. An officer also spotted that Joseph
There's
seemed to
mud on
have
his face.
cuts on his knuckles. As they inspected further, the door to Tammy's house appeared to have been kicked in. Now also concerned, officers told Joseph that they needed to pat him down to make sure that he didn't have any weapons that could potentially harm them. Upon asking this request, Joseph declined, so the officers had no other choice but to arrest Joseph and search him. During this search, they pulled out a knife from his pocket, and this knife was covered in blood. One of the officers later testified that she entered the home through the back door that had been kicked in. She found a trail of blood throughout the house, all over the walls, the floor,
On the
everywhere.
walls.
They then entered the
The
bathroom
fuck
of the
was he
house.
trying to eat or some shit? What the
Inside,
fuck? Why is the
a
blood on the
tent
walls?
covered the bathtub. They pulled back the tent and found Tammy's body in the tub. Her body had been horrendously mutilated, and she was missing a large part of her skull. Investigators were brought in to determine what exactly happened, and Joseph was taken into custody. When examining the
like the
crime scene
Tammy
and
fucking-
Tammy's body,
What's
investigators
his name?
made a
Jason?
number of truly horrific and
Cut off
disturbing
her skull. Are you
discoveries.
crazy?
Tammy had been stabbed dozens of times and had suffered severe blunt force trauma. An electrical power tool had been used to cut inside her body, and other tools were used to open up her chest, one of them
That's
being
disgusting.
an electrical
That's
saw.
that-
Joseph had then used a knife to cut and remove parts of her lung and entire
That's
heart.
disgusting.
Tammy's skull
Oh
had
my
also
fucking
been
days,
cut
bro.
with the power saw. Large chunks of her brain
power
had
saw?
been removed,
Where do you
some
get
of
that?
which was found in the bathtub with her, along with large chunks of her skull. As Tammy's house was inspected, they discovered that part of her organs that were missing were found on a dinner plate next to the frying pan.
Bro,
Joseph
fuck that. Fuck that. Fuck that. Death penalty. Death penalty. You don't deserve prison time. Death penalty. You're telling me you cut off her lungs and put it in a plate and you're about to eat it before the police came. Death penalty. Death penalty. Not even let your cat shoot him. Put him in the chair and shoot him. You don't have to be like one of them. Like, do it back in the old days when they string them up and shoot him. Put him on a string, shoot him.
had cooked
you
and
crazy?
cannibalized Tammy. He had eaten
disgusting.
parts of her brain, lung, and heart.
For
Joseph
what?
was questioned.
Why?
During this
Just 'cause you
interview
broke
with
your
the
heart,
police,
you
he
bitch.
explained
So you
that
wanna
he
go-
had indeed eaten
Jesus.
Tammy's brain, and that he had also tried to pull out her third eye with tongs. He also admitted to eating large parts of her lungs and heart. Investigators asked where Tammy's heart was. He replied by saying, "I ate it. It's part of me now." He was questioned as to
Bro,
why
ate her heart because
he
she
ate her
broke up with
body.
you.
Joseph
So instead of
said
getting your heart
he was
broken, you want to
already
eat her heart
dead.
instead.
After this
You bitch.
interview, he was placed in a padded cell, where he began to beat his chest and pant heavily. To commit such a gruesome crime usually means that the perpetrator is severely mentally ill. Mental health professionals began the lengthy process of determining if Joseph was mentally competent enough to stand trial. In the meantime, Joseph would change his story. He said that his head had been fuzzy following the murder of Tammy because he too had been attacked. So, this is his second story. According to Joseph, he had gone to Tammy's house to collect some belongings. But upon entering her house, he had found 2 men who had broken in. Upon seeing Joseph, these 2 men supposedly attacked him and rendered him unconscious. He claimed that these 2 men had stabbed, killed, and eaten Tammy. Joseph also said that he believed the 2 men were planning to cut his head off and eat his brain. Joseph was charged with murder. After some time, and after being assessed by multiple professionals, Joseph was deemed not mentally fit to stand trial in 2017. Joseph was then given medical and psychological treatment, and in 2018 he was deemed fit to stand trial, nearly 4 years after the crime had been committed. The trial would begin in 2019. This trial, however, wouldn't last long. One of the jury members was aware of Joseph's past. To have a fair trial, the jury was supposed to have no prior knowledge of his manslaughter conviction. This jury member spoke to a number of other jury members and told them what he had done previously. When the courts found out about this, the trial was ruled as a mistrial. A new trial would need to be set up. However, this again would take some time. The courts needed the go-ahead from mental health professionals that Joseph was fit again to stand trial. During this time, Joseph was offered an insanity plea, but Joseph declined to take it. He said to the judge that using the insanity defense would be in part amount to admitting guilt to the jurors, and said, "I don't suffer from any mental illness." A second trial would begin in September of 2020, 6 years after the death of Tammy. During the trial, the jury was shown a number of photographs of the crime scene and was shown evidence that Joseph had consumed some of her brain, lungs, and heart. Before the jury were presented with these images, they were warned how graphic and gruesome they were, and were described as worse than anything you would see in a horror film. Joseph took to the stand and claimed that 2 black men had broken into Tammy's house.
He's racist as well. Jesus Christ. He's racist as well. Man said 2 black men. You could have said 2 white men. You had to say 2 black men because you think 2 black guys would do that type of shit. You bastard. He's racist as well. Dickhead.
The ones responsible for her death. When asked about the initial confession, Joseph stated that he had been coerced by investigators to confess, and claimed that when he was being questioned, he was in a vulnerable state of mind. The defense then warned the jury not to be distracted from the facts of the case by, quote, emotional evidence. The prosecution stated that Joseph's story of intruders was a fabrication, and that he, and he alone, was responsible for the death and cannibalization of Tammy. The prosecutor said, "She suffered so many indignities that night. She was terrified, she was stabbed, she was dismembered, and she was eaten, all at the hands of Joseph." One of Tammy's friends also testified. She spoke of the horrific weekend Tammy had suffered at the hands of Joseph in the week before the murder. Messages were shown to the court from Tammy's phone, where she confided with this friend, highlighting how she was scared of him. The 911 call placed by Tammy in the early hours of the morning before her murder was also brought up, showing that Joseph had already tried to break into her house that morning. A psychologist that assessed Joseph testified and stated that he was the most severely mentally ill person who she had ever reviewed. Joseph's defense told the court that he had a bulge lodged in his brain and that this was a major cause for his mental health issues. They went on to claim that this should be taken into account when finding him guilty or not guilty of murder. Joseph was thankfully found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was removed from court, he continued to insist that he was innocent. What is incredibly frustrating about this case is that Joseph has proven himself to be a serious danger to society not once, but twice. Yet, his lawyers are helping him to get a retrial and have launched an appeal. His defense lawyer said,
Put him under the jail, kill him.
Look at the horrors visited
Look at his
upon
eyes.
Tammy and conclude that
Bro,
they were
does
simply
not
the
sleep.
actions of a monster.
Why
But doing
bits
so
red?
would be reductive, and this court's review must look deeper. The court must consider his actions in the context of his profound mental illness. They went on to say, there is also no question that Joseph was suffering from severe mental illness when he committed his crimes. What there is a question about, however, is whether Tammy would still be alive today if Joseph were not so severely mentally ill. There are reasons to believe that she would. Because of that, Joseph asks this court to find his sentence of life without parole inappropriate. End quote. As far as I can tell, these proceedings are ongoing. I would sometimes like to ask these lawyers who try to get such reoffending murderers off if they would ever like to live next door to them. The chances are they wouldn't. But if they were ever to somehow get a reoffending murderer out, someone would have to live next door to them. And just like how Tammy was unaware of his past, they could be too. As I mentioned earlier, in 2013, whilst Joseph was on parole, he choked someone out whilst he was naked and was allowed to be released on bail. The prosecutor who allowed this bail to go through resigned from his
So you see your dick and
following
ass and
the death
everything,
of
you choked
Tammy.
him.
The case of Tammy is by far one of the most gruesome true crime cases out there. The horror of what happened to her is only compounded by just how long it took for Joseph to be brought to justice. Something that must have been horrendous for Tammy's family and for those who cared about her. The police who worked on this case have said that the crime scene was one of the most gruesome in Jeffersonville's history.
Of course it would be. That's disgusting, bro. Bro, ate our brains, bro. That's for the fuck, some zombie. Left for dead type of zombie.